So, Steve, there are a number of major regulatory issues that are poised to impact CCA's membership, and I wanted to discuss a few of those as well as what the big picture total is. So, first, let's talk about coverage mapping. The FCC uses coverage maps to allocate and prioritize funding for rural broadband expansion, and right now they're positioned to spend $9 billion expanding 5G into rural America based on two options. Option one, use existing data, start the auction in 2021. Option two, develop a new data set and push that auction out a little further. So, what do you think is the best path forward here? And why is it that we have this persistent problem with the quality of broadband mapping data?
Yes, thank you, Sean. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Yeah, it's really sort of interesting. We believe that the FCC is literally offered up a false choice. You can either uh, spend the money based on unreliable, incorrect data, or you can wait 3 years to gather the data and use that to expend the funds. And I really believe that the FCC is, yeah, it's a either it's a choice that shouldn't have to happen. We can do both. You can have new collection of data, and you can have, and I think continue to keep the 2021 auction date for everyone to shoot for. And it's hard to explain why the FCC would come out with, in my mind, such a rigorous false choice that doesn't really bear much in reality. I testified, CCA testified, House and the Senate over 2 years ago, and basically identified the real problem. And that was the FCC was asking the wrong question. We knew that the data that they had requested under this 477 data request was not going to produce usable maps. We testified to that, and we suggested that, well, if you would actually use real data and information like the engineers use when they're designing the networks, you would get a quality data. People forget the FCC changed their mapping baseline 3 different times during the reverse auction process itself, which was sort of ironic that now they're saying that the 477 data is acceptable. So we indicated that you would get false security in their mapping numbers, and they actually suggested that the carriers may not have submitted the correct data, and I think that is also an incorrect statement and assumption. The carriers provided the data and information the FCC requested. We told them, I testified in the Senate, and the Senator Wicker asked me specifically, Mr. Barry, why is it that the maps are not accurate? And then I told him, I said, garbage in, garbage out.
Foundational to these rural 5G initiatives and the funding that goes with them is this notion of bridging the digital divide. That's a term that gets used a lot in policy and telecom circles. And it's something that's been brought into sharp focus during COVID-19, which is prompting this massive shift towards work from home, towards remote learning, and towards telehealth and things of that nature. I'm curious what you're hearing from your membership, Steve, about how this change in network usage is hitting your members' networks, and also if you're aware of any communities or institutions that are really feeling the pain right now due to lack of access to broadband.
Yes, the COVID-19 issue has brought into sharp focus the fact that there are areas in the United States, particularly in the rural areas, that don't have access to adequate broadband capability. We knew that before, and there's no one more focused on closing the digital divide than our CCA members. I mean, they're community based. They live in the community that they provide services to. And whether it's their neighbor or the guy at the gal at the grocery store, they talk to people that says, "Hey, I need more capability," and so they're dedicated to doing that. And when this first hit, many of our carriers, um, we had a huge demand, and they were trying to figure out how do you get your crews on the ground. Actually, and we had enormous requests for increase of speed, increase of capacity, capability, and I think over the last 4 weeks, many of our carriers have figured out, okay, here's we worked hard and worked with the task force to make sure many of our carriers had PPE, personal protection equipment, because they were going into homes and going into facilities and businesses that all of a sudden wanted enhanced capability. So I think they've done a really good job of responding, and there's some great stories out there. Vermont Telephone, VT, Michelle Goutet is the CEO up there, actually turned on a 5G network in two small rural areas because he knew that the school had no coverage. So he went out, got Wi-Fi, MiFi, devices. We helped him find them on the marketplace. He put them in. He's providing not only free Wi-Fi within that school area, but he's also figuring out ways that you could put Wi-Fi on buses and get it closer to the kids. He's providing that to the government. It's sort of expanded, and many of our carriers are doing the same thing.
I also wanted to discuss Huawei. A number of CCA's members use equipment provided by Huawei, and there's two issues there I wanted to discuss. One of them is something that you brought up in testimony in front of the Senate in March, and that's regarding making sure there's a secure global supply chain for 5G and other telecom network equipment. So, Steve, I'm curious what you think the industry needs from policymakers in terms of guidance around fostering that secure supply chain and creating trust and mechanisms for verification.
That's a multi-part question in many respects. First, we got clear direction from the Congress when they said no covered equipment in your networks. I mean, that was pretty, direct. Now we need Congress to actually provide the funding. They created a program, and now we need to actually find a way to provide the funding for that program. So that's Congress's part. And then we need to figure out a way to implement that program. And we're meeting right now. We've met with the FCC. We met with NTIA yesterday, quite matter of fact, and CISA, out of DHS. And what we're trying to show them is this is extremely, complicated process because every network is different, and every network has different, it's built differently and has different network elements in it. So there's not a template that you can say, hey, here's the template, just go follow it. So what we're trying to do with NTIA is share with them an actual strategic game plan of how you literally replace every element of the network before you rip it out. Because in rural America, especially, you want to keep 911 connectivity. You and I and others want to be able to talk and have a broadband capability. You have to build a network side by side the other network if you're going to rip it out. So that's what we're trying to do now, and we're finding that, as I testified in the Senate, this has never been done before.
And further on Huawei, Steve, you mentioned the rip and replace and the need to essentially build parallel networks, one out of approved equipment, put that into place, turn down the old one, and somehow maintain business continuity and service continuity throughout that process. I'm just curious at this point, do you think the $2 billion in funding being considered for rip and replace, is that enough to let some of CCA's members actually do this?
I don't know if that's enough or not. That number came from, by the way, FCC letter, a request from the FCC to the Appropriations Committee, that when they identified what they thought the price would be. I'm not so sure that that's the right number. It could very well be. Um, right now we're working with a couple of our members, getting actual bids from different vendors and putting together, all the different elements of the network and a time frame of which you could accomplish that. And you have to remember that some of these carriers are in such remote areas that they may not have access to their cell sites or towers, but maybe 3 months out of the year. And we we still have sort of a shortfall of crews, and we're finishing up the 600 megahertz repack, and we're talking about building new networks in urban suburban areas as well as rural. So the time frame gets extended by the COVID, and then it gets even further focused when you try to find the equipment and have it there and test it and make sure that your legacy network can transition over to a new network.
And then, Steve, on that big picture question, as we go through this generational shift from LTE to 5G, what can CCA do? What can CCA's members do to ensure that they're best positioned for success in this 5G era?
Good question. Number one, we are the advocacy arm for our members here in Washington, D.C. So it's our goal to make sure that they have all the critical elements they need in order to be successful. Spectrum. We have the CBRS spectrum auction coming up. We have C-band. We're working with the FCC and others on making sure mid-band spectrum is going to be out there. We hope that they make a decision on L-band, going forward, because mid-band is going to be literally the critical slice of spectrum going forward if we're going to make it to 5G. You have to have the spectrum. You have to know that the spectrum that's out there will operate with your devices and with your equipment that you're putting up in your network. So that's a critical element. And then we literally need to make sure that not only the spectrum is made available, but some of the rules and regulations that provide that will ensure that the smaller carriers have an opportunity to bid and win in the spectrum. And we also need to streamline the infrastructure and the siting requirements, as well as the rollouts of this new technology in areas that never really had it before. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Steve, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today and keep me up on how CCA is advocating on behalf of its membership.
Thank you, and thank you for the time. You guys have been great partners with us on our show, and unfortunately, we had to cancel our show in Dallas, but we're looking forward to seeing you and everyone in person here in October at our show for the fall show down in Amelia Island, Florida. By that time, I think everyone will need a little break.